Carmelo Anthony has quickly developed a huge target on his back for hot takes around NBA media, from people claiming he's not worth a starting spot anymore to people saying that he was never actually that great and that his only function was to score points in bunches. But regardless of what he's doing now, there was a time when teams were entering full-blown bidding wars for his services that would cost damn near half of a roster to acquire him through trade. That was mostly because during the 2000s, he was consistently a top scorer and player in the league, and the common thought was that pairing him with other superstar talent would yield a championship contender. So then, what happened to him in his time with Denver? How did the Nuggets manage to lose a guy that was viewed as a franchise-altering player despite being a competitive team for most of his time there? Well, out of all the players I've done one of these for, Melo's case was actually pretty cut and dry for the most part, and you're gonna have an easy time understanding it if you were watching hoops around 2010 and 2011, and then you're also gonna learn how events at his wedding hilariously led him to requesting a trade from Denver. Melo was drafted to a 17-win Nuggets team in the midst of an 8-year playoff drought during the front-heavy 2003 draft. They did make other adjustments to the starting lineup upon adding him to the roster, but you can still give him major credit for improving them to a 43-win team the very next season and helping them to the playoffs for the first time since Dikembe Mutombo last took them there in 1995. But there pretty much lies our first problem with Melo's relationship with the Nuggets. Despite the team consistently winning in the West over the years, hanging around the 45 to 50 win total, there was almost never any real strides taken in the postseason. Take a look at the next 4 years after his rookie season. First round loss, first round loss, first round loss, and guess what? First round loss. So there was a situation where Melo was clearly improving as an individual, which you could see in his scoring, but it never resulted in any big team success. This phenomenon was further explained by coach George Karl, who I'm sure by now you've heard didn't exactly love his time spent coaching Anthony. In his 2016 book, Karl said that Melo was the best offensive player he'd ever coached, but also that he was, quote, a user of people, addicted to the spotlight, and very unhappy when he had to share it. He also claimed that he had a low demand of himself on defense and that he had no commitment to the hard work of stopping the other guy. So yeah, basically everything you guys say about a 33-year-old Melo, he was saying about Melo in his 20s. Nevertheless, the Nuggets felt they could win with him, and they made a couple of attempts to push the team over the top, the first of which came in December of 2006, just months after they'd suffered their third straight first-round exit at the hands of the Clippers. Also in December of 2006 came the day when the league suspended Carmelo Anthony for 15 games due to his involvement in the huge brawl with New York, which was basically a sucker punch and one of the funniest full-court chases you'll ever see. I also hope the irony of this happening in New York isn't lost on you. But at the time of that event, Melo was leading the league in scoring, so his prolonged absence was going to leave a damaging void for the Nuggets to fill. Denver responded by sending Andre Miller, Joe Smith, and draft picks to Philly in exchange for Allen Iverson, who had recently demanded a trade from the Sixers. Despite this move coming maybe 2 or 3 years too late for it to have had any serious effect, AI was still averaging 26 points and 7 assists the year before he was traded there at age 31. But the age of production wasn't necessarily the problem here, it was redundancy. Iverson and Melo sounds awesome on paper, especially the younger they are, but it was a very one-dimensional pairing. Neither of them were great defenders, but both loved to score, especially in isolation. They did a good job of that together, but most championship duos bring some type of versatility to the table that takes an entire team to another level. The bulk of what the Nuggets needed from Iverson was distribution and fluid control of the offense, but the bulk of what they got was scoring. Good enough for their first 51 season since they drafted Melo, but not good enough to compete with the likes of the Spurs or the Lakers in the first round of the playoffs. Both resulted in consecutive first round exits, prompting Denver to make their best move of the Melo era, trading Allen Iverson for Chauncey Billups. Of course, history remembers Iverson as the better player because he was, but Billups was far closer to what the Nuggets actually needed, seeing as how Iverson was basically an undersized shooting guard pretending to be a point guard while playing for them. Not only was Billups capable of handling big moments, but the ball moved much more fluidly around the team and everyone was more involved than they'd ever been throughout the whole Carmelo era. Despite Anthony fracturing his hand during the 2009 season, under Billups' leadership in his absence, they still managed a 54-win season, which was the most games they'd won in the Melo era. To follow that up, not only did they fly through the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, eliminating both the Mavs and the Hornets in 5 games, but they got as far as a 2-2 series with the defending Western Conference champion Lakers. And for one of the few times you could ever say it, Melo really exerted himself on the defensive end when he was matched up with Kobe Bryant. But like I said in my last video with Dwight Howard, they'd simply run into a Kobe Bryant and Lakers team that was possessed. They fell after 6 games, and unfortunately, that was as good as it was ever going to get from Melo in Denver. Their team performance was about the same in 2010 as they attained 53 wins, but then they were bounced in the first round of the playoffs by the Boozer and Williams-led Jazz, erasing pretty much all the progress they made up to that point. Now the fun begins. After all those years of losing for Melo, a little something called the decision happened that summer where a certain someone named Lebron decided to take his talents to South Beach, completely turning the balance of power in the NBA on its head. That move sent more shockwaves and had more influence over other players than people are ever gonna know, but the official ending to Melo's relationship with Denver started at his wedding later that summer. A lot of high-profile people were invited, including LeBron James, Chris Paul, Amar'e Stoudemire, and the Nuggets owner Stan Kroenke. During that event, LeBron proposed a toast where he suggested that Anthony find a way to New York to team up with Stoudemire because that was the only way he'd stand a chance against Miami. Chris Paul egged this on by suggesting that both he and Melo were going to find a way to New York and that they were going to form their own big three to go against Miami. Yeah, for those of you who didn't know, we were definitely waiting on a Paul, Melo, Stoudemire big three to happen back then. But there's like 4 things that happened here. 1. The owner of the Nuggets just kinda sat there and awkwardly listened while top NBA players urged his star player to ditch the team. 2. A lot of other members were cheering at the idea of Melo going home and, wait for it, ditching the team. 3. Melo himself didn't encourage or discourage these conversations about ditching the team despite knowing the owner was present. And 4. When Melo suggested that the owner make a toast so everyone could finally acknowledge his presence, Kroenke suggested that Chris Paul end up with Denver, to which nobody really responded or cheered. That wedding kind of sort of really damaged the relationship between Melo and the owner, and a few weeks later, he made it formally known that he did want to trade and that he didn't think the Nuggets were headed in a championship direction. Aside from only getting remotely close to a title one time during his tenure with the Nuggets, he was also referring to the fact that the core of that team was more than likely about to break up. Anthony was set to become a free agent in 2011, meanwhile Kenyon Martin, J.R. Smith, Marcus Camby, and Chauncey Billups were all also in their contract years. The Nuggets offered Melo a deal of 3 years worth $65 million, but signing that meant he very well could have been opting into a full rebuild for the next few years. For a player who was still at the top of his game, combined with the idea that the Nuggets had only surrounded him with the contending team one time, combined with the new idea LeBron presented about players taking control of their destiny, Melo felt it was time to take matters into his own hands. By not signing the extension, he put Denver in a position we're all familiar with by now, where they all but had to trade him or risk losing him for nothing in the summer. This also forced a bidding war that we can now officially say hurt Anthony's time with the Knicks. The best thing for everybody would have been for Melo to sign with New York as a free agent during the summer, because they did have a nice core around Stoudemire, and throwing Anthony into that mix back then could have made them immediate contenders. However, by virtue of him not signing an extension because he didn't want to give Denver any leverage, the Knicks couldn't risk him being traded to their counterpart in Brooklyn, where he very well might have stayed long term if they found a way to acquire Dwight Howard. And he might have just stayed in general, because that was basically the same thing as going home. That gave us this really awkward chapter where we were waiting on the next super team to rise next to the Heat. We were thinking Melo and Dwight in Brooklyn, Melo and Paul in New York, Chris Paul and Dwight in LA, basically just a bunch of what ifs that all came fairly close to happening. In the end, Melo and Billups were traded to the Knicks mid-season for Wilson Chandler, Raymond Felton, Danilo Gallinari, Timothy Mozgov, and draft picks. What the Knicks sent in exchange for Melo was entirely too much for almost any one player, but at least you now understand it was basically a move of desperation during a bidding war, and they truly did think they weren't going to get another chance to pair him with Stoudemire, who was averaging 26 points per game when the trade went down. It could have very easily turned into the situation we see now with the Lakers, where they missed out on Paul George because they didn't trade for him when they had the chance. But of course, Amar'e succumbed to injuries almost immediately, and that left the world with a very underwhelming 5 years of the Carmelo Anthony and New York saga. So how the Nuggets managed to lose a generational scorer was pretty cut and dry. They lost for years, they tried to make big strides at the end of the process, and then time just ran out on a core that they only got to build for about a year or two. But the more significant part of this is the role LeBron's decision played in the quote-unquote rebellion of superstar players. Barely a year after he did that, Melo forced his way out of Denver, Paul made it clear he wasn't wasting the rest of his prime in New Orleans, and Dwight also pushed his way out of Orlando after a fairly lengthy dispute. This was all part of the us versus them mentality that was going on at the time due to the pending lockout dispute happening between players and owners. As Ian Thompson put it in The Soul of Basketball while talking about the events of Carmelo's wedding, quote, "The decision had ignited a quiet rebellion in which stars like Anthony were happy to continue receiving huge salaries from their employers while at the same time plotting against them. Who knows, maybe it's not that deep or nefarious, but note that Melo never made a mention of being traded until after the decision and after LeBron's toast at the wedding. He probably would have ended up outside of Denver at some point in his career, but this is how that happened. And that's what I got for you guys today. If you enjoyed, hit the like button, comment, and sub, and hit the bell next to my name if you want notifications on future videos. Also be sure to sub to my second channel because I'm posting there more and more frequently these days. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.